So good morning everyone, and welcome to the next session in this stream, which of course is leadership in a post-Covid-19 world. And in particular, we're going to talk today about business continuity, supply chains and sustainability, lessons learned in 2020. So by way of introduction, we've got a fantastic panel this morning. So I'd like to introduce you to Jane Jones. So Jane is the commercial manager for Argyll and Bute Council, with responsibility for catering, cleaning, and which of course includes school meals across the whole council. But Jane's also the chair of the National Assist FM Group, which is an organisation that represents all 32 councils for all matters relating to catering, cleaning and FM. I'd also like to introduce Mel Mackenzie, who's an interim strategic procurement manager for commercial and procurement shared services for Aberdeen City, Aberdeenshire and the Highland Council as well. So welcome, Mel. And then finally, but certainly no means least, Mark Thompson, who is a senior manager within Response, Renew and Recovery for Dumfries and Galloway Council. So welcome everyone, thank you. Just a couple of points of housekeeping. You can, as you will see, all of you are muted, and if you could maintain that. If you're not already muted by the administrators, then please maintain your camera and your voice on mute just to protect the bandwidth. If you have a question during the session, you can add it to the chat, on an ongoing basis. Each of our presenters will show some slides for about 10 minutes each, so we've got plenty of time at the end of the session to make it as dynamic as possible. So please, I would encourage you to be as interactive as possible. And at the end, you'll be given the opportunity to either raise your hand if you want to ask your question in person, or alternatively, the team or myself will pick it up in the chat. Couple of things, but I guess by way of introduction, all of us have seen a year like no other. And in actual fact, you could have been forgiven by October, November, forgetting that there was another big event that was around the corner called Brexit. But if we reflect on, certainly in our experience in Scotland Excel last year, if there was ever an example where you really need to emphasise the importance of working together and collaboration, it was last year, whether it was collating PPE demand or whether it was working closely with each other or our supply chains to maintain that collaborative focus, then I think that was of paramount importance. If we now think about where we currently are, we breathed a sigh of relief at the end of the year, and then we've seen pressures on our supply chains this year like no others. And it's not just about variability in supply, it's about some of the pricing that goes with it. And some of them, we can correlate to our business as usual. So for example, within construction, it's well known that the highest amount of money in the UK importing construction materials is within electrical cable. Over the course of the last 12 months, the price of copper has increased by a factor of 2.5. But even if you think about it, this doesn't just affect big supply chains. If you pop into your local B&Q, you'll find the shelves are empty if you want to buy a packet of screws or you want to buy a bag of cement. So it's really affected everybody, both in terms of the keen DIYers right up to what we're trying to do across our sector in particular. So I think that, again, re-emphasising the most important thing that I think that we've learned, certainly within Scotland Excel, is the importance of strong collaborative links. And I think today's another great example of that. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Jane. Jane, I'll leave you to share your slides. So thank you everyone, and welcome.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Hugh. I'll just pop the first slide on. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. I feel really privileged to be here today to share our experiences with you. When I was planning my presentation, I had two ideas. The first was to keep it quite high level and to talk about the excellent work that we undertake nationally to collaboratively support our caterers and our food and drink supply chain, and how our well-established networks, there we are, enable that to happen. So this wheel here, which Assist FIM developed with Scottish Government, clearly shows the mature, interconnected and joined up way we deliver school meals in Scotland. It clearly recognises the role of Scotland Excel in our supply chain and a variety of other partners. But instead of that, I thought I would tell you the story of Argyll and Bute's community food response, and hopefully you'll see for yourself some of the lessons we've learned or solidified about collaborative working, resilient supply chains, and the value we place in sustainability. And I think most importantly, the impact that our work then has on our communities and for us, on our children and young people. So I'm going to take you back in time to a dim and distant past, that is a time before COVID. Late 2019, if you can remember that far back. And for us working in Council FM services, we were busy. So we were planning for the implementation of really significant food and drink in schools changes. So local authority catering and procurement staff all across Scotland were working really closely with colleagues in Scotland Excel, COSLA, Scottish Government, and of course our suppliers. And what we were doing is we were looking to do some reformulation, we were working on product development, and we were ensuring that we could still deliver choice for our children and young people. And Hugh, as you rightly said, of course, we were still fully planning for the impact of EU exit and what that might mean for food and drink supply. Now, our suppliers had resilience plans in place, and we were concerned that we would be facing possible food shortages or indeed food price increases. And then we watched, as everyone else did across the world, as coronavirus emerged and, well, took over everything, I think it's fair to say. For those of us working in local authority catering, however, we knew that we would have to spring into action. We weren't one of the teams that was all of a sudden redundant and without a workload. We had upwards of 145,000 children and young people entitled to free school meals, potentially going without food. We heard, as everyone did, that people were being told not to leave their homes. And we saw for ourselves empty supermarket shelves. It's amazing how quickly we forget this, but food and other basic commodities were becoming scarce and quite hard to get hold of. So we were really in a concerned position. So in the very early stages last year, throughout March and February and March, we worked with Scottish Government to develop a food fund. Now that was £70 million. 60 million of it initially was allocated directly to local authorities. That was 30 million for the provision of food for free school meal entitled children, 30 million for the provision of food to communities, not something that's usually part of our day job. With the remaining 10 million was allocated to the third sector to deliver wider support across Scotland. Now, along with that money came some guidance that we developed in partnership with Scottish Government. And that guidance gave each local authority the opportunity to spend its allocation flexibly and in the most appropriate way to meet needs of their most vulnerable people, including children in receipt of free school meals and those who had to remain at home. Now, that guidance focused on making sure that the response was appropriate and dignified, and it was designed to enable a whole household whole needs response. So in Argyll and Bute, we quickly established a community food project headed up by a really experienced project manager and a team of experts drawn from across the council and a number of partner agencies, including Oban Business Improvement District. We had a retired logistics expert who volunteered his services. We had a former CEO of Sodexo who volunteered, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, just to name a few of our key delivery team. So lesson one for us was a simple one. You have no idea the skills that you have in your own council or in your own community and how they can contribute differently from what they do in their day job. So we couldn't have done this, for instance, without Pete, who's our waste manager turned supermarket guru, or our head teacher, Bernie, turned triage problem solver, or our process improvement officer, Steve, turned logistics expert. Turns out Steve formerly worked in logistics with Sainsbury's. Who knew? It's not what he does in his day job for the council. So our initial project had a number of key strands to it, supporting our existing food banks who were at risk of being overwhelmed, helping to tackle supply chain issues for retail, triaging support for families who were in need of food now, and then also establishing longer term food support for as long as people were being advised not to leave our homes. So we clearly saw for ourselves that to provide support well, we had to work in partnership with community groups, with the third sector, and also with businesses, and of course with our existing supply chain. Now, for children entitled to free school meals, we retained the provision of a hot lunch for as long as we possibly could. We worked with our schools to do doorstep deliveries each day. Here's some of the deliveries going out in the Dunoon area using our pupil transport vehicles and to our children in Lochgilphead. Now, we did that for a few reasons. First of all, foolishly, we thought lockdown would last for 3 weeks and then we would reopen the schools and go back to normal. How we laugh now. We wanted to keep things as normal as possible for our children, and we wanted to enable pupil welfare checks and for food to be delivered along with learning materials and tech support. But also we had stock in our kitchens and it needed to be used. Moreover, our suppliers were sitting with stock that they had purchased in readiness for EU exit and for normal operations, which we also knew needed to be used up. So we did our best to help support the supply chain to use up that stock first. That was our priority. But we realised after between 3 and 6 weeks that this was going to be a long-term issue and needed more direct support. So we pivoted. In Argyll and Bute, we already have a really positive and supporting working arrangement with our food and drink suppliers. And with hospitality closing, we just knew they would be under pressure. So this is our food provenance map. It shows our supply chain, and it's a mix of Scotland XL nationally managed contracts and some locally managed ones too. So when we started to develop a food delivery system for households in need, we knew we wanted to use those existing relationships to protect local jobs, to support local businesses and to keep them operating. We also knew we would need the support of our suppliers via our national contracts to ensure that we had the necessary volume of store cupboard essentials to enable us to do that. So that's what we did. We developed a distribution network to all of our communities, including rural, remote and island populations. We provided them with both ambient parcels and with fresh food. That included things like local milk, cheese, eggs, yoghurt, fruit and veg. What that meant in reality was the local bakery where we buy our bread for our school meals was able to get staff off furlough and back to work, making fresh bread rolls for our food deliveries. Our fruit and veg supplier provided us with fresh seasonal fruit and veg. Bear in mind, all of his restaurants had closed, so we were able to provide them with ongoing work throughout this process. And what they provided changed as the weeks progressed. They too brought drivers back from furlough to support our community food deliveries. So the fresh food parcels we delivered also to those who were shielding, so they received more than just what was provided in their national box. And we used an army of volunteers to do this. School staff, catering staff, ultimately people from around 200 organisations helped, including Mountain Rescue and the Coast Guard. The biggest challenge we faced was accessing retail pack sizes of dried goods. And we worked with our existing grocery contractor to fulfil as much of that as we could. We were already working with them, as I say, to reduce the EU exit stockpiling. So we took a range of goods from them to provide variety and to mix up the content of our deliveries. We did, further down the line, have to issue a GNCA to purchase retail pack sizes separately, but we exhausted every avenue that we had with our existing providers before we got to that point. And our procurement colleagues were great at ensuring that we did what it took to support our communities. In our island communities, we took a slightly different approach for some of it. We saw small local shops beginning to close, and we knew that if we added to that problem by flying in or shipping over food parcels, they would have no choice but to close their doors. So instead, we funded them to provide the fresh food parcels, to provide them to those in their communities, and helped coordinate the doorstep deliveries with them. So we looked at ways that local communities could help to support themselves, and by using local shops, we enabled them to stay open. That helped to support the wholesale supply chain, and it also meant that others in the community could continue to buy from and use the shops because we kept them open, or they were able to keep open for themselves. So one of the key lessons for us, though, was to keep our vulnerable people in our communities at the heart of our planning, and it's very easy to lose sight of that in the midst of the pandemic pressures. We wanted our communities to feel supported and cared for, so we worked to identify other businesses that we hadn't worked with before, who we also thought might have been suffering through lockdown, but could have stock that would need to be used up too. and would also make our communities feel more valued. So we started to do things like using the Island Bakery biscuits. Much of their existing market had disappeared. So we were able to buy stock off them and put them in our food deliveries. We also used local shower gel, shampoo and toiletries in our essentials packs. We also used those deliveries, incidentally, to get information to people. It wasn't just about food. So we provided health advice, police advice on staying safe, recipe ideas, and our local food banks devised a Worrying About Money leaflet that explains how pupils could access financial support and help. So we provided all that through the deliveries too. Another key lesson was about business continuity planning and community contingency planning in general. Most of those plans contained little or no reference to food, and none of them that I'm aware of, and I think this is probably a big issue across the board, none of them considered how we would provide food and household support to people for a prolonged period of time. Now that still needs to be addressed, and I think we need to think about food insecurity differently, making sure that there is resilience in the food supply that quite frankly doesn't exist with just-in-time deliveries and with a reliance on online shopping. So here's, I'm beginning to summarise some of this, but here I wanted to share with you the feedback that we received from some of those who got our support. I've got so many stories that I could share, but one in particular was of a young lad with learning difficulties and his dad who received strawberries and cream in their fresh food delivery because they were shielding. And they kept some of the seeds back to grow their own strawberries. Now, they told us that it was the little things, the strawberries and cream, that meant they knew that someone wasn't just firing bread and basics out to them, but someone was thinking about them and cared that they had different meals each week with local seasonal fruit and veg. So what to some was maybe just strawberries and cream, others saw as care. That is the power of our supply chain and what it means to our people. For me, the pandemic has been a huge learning curve, and it has borne out in practice many of the key ways in which school food in particular and public sector food in general can deliver for a wide variety of strategic priority areas of importance across local government in a way that no other commodity really can. Food helps to tackle the consequences of poverty and inequality. It can help to level the playing field. It gives our children and young people the fuel they need to learn and play and can help to tackle the attainment gap. If we provide good quality balanced food, we can tackle health inequalities and a range of issues from malnutrition to obesity. Food procurement helps support economic recovery during and after the pandemic and should absolutely be a key strategy in any inclusive growth planning and community wealth building. And it helps to drive forward the sustainability agenda, tackling climate change, reducing our carbon impact and addressing increased food miles. All of those things are simple when we start to look locally. Finally, most importantly, food is a way that we show we care about our communities and those in need. It shows that we care about our children and young people. And it's a critical way that leaders in Scotland and across the world can, at low cost, offset so many issues. It always comes back to this for me, to our children and young people and their families. But this could easily be a photo of our care home residents or our hospital inpatients. We all have a duty to make sure that those who receive public sector food have good quality, sustainable, tasty and nutritious meals that someone, our hardworking and dedicated catering staff, has cared about making. So, quick whistle-stop tour about where we got to last year and some of the lessons we learned. Thank you for allowing me to outline those that we have taken on board in the past 15 or 16 months or so, and I am really looking forward to the broader discussion.
Fantastic, Jane. Thank you very much. We didn't want to stop you mid-flow, but there was a problem showing your slides, which is a team's problem as opposed to an individual. And I certainly didn't want to stop you in flow. So what I would suggest that we do is we'll share Mel's and Mark's, because there's less likelihood of that happening again. So Mel, if you don't mind, the team are going to show them, and when you're ready to move on, then if you could just highlight to them, I think that's a bit more risk averse, if you don't mind. Are you okay with that, Mel? Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hugh, for the introduction. So my presentation this morning covers business continuity, supply chains and sustainability, and looking really at the lessons learned post-COVID and Brexit. I guess the implications for both have presented us all with some fairly significant challenges over the last 14 months now. But what I've taken from it is actually in some instances there have been some unique opportunities to take lessons learned and plan for the future. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I think March last year, probably, a date well ingrained in everybody's, mind. We obviously had to move fairly quickly to start looking at supply chain sustainability. It was really quickly realised that that would be a key theme in supporting, each of the councils we worked with, in their response. We also had to act really quickly in reviewing and applying guidance issued. So just round about the work we carried out there, so round about supply chain mapping and supplier sustainability is where I'm going to focus on during this brief talk. Next slide, please. So to allow us to formulate a response across the 3 councils that we work with, we developed a collaborative process as to how we would address supplier sustainability and look at how we could assess the risks to our supply chains and then focus our efforts on where our supply chains would require support. We initially decided we would revisit our categorisation of suppliers, so i.e. strategic, critical, etc., to ensure that these were all up to date and accurate. So our category managers within our team did a really good job of doing an initial pass of that, which we then went and validated with all our service areas. And I think, credit to all of our team and, I think public sector generally across Scotland and how flexible and agile teams were at pulling together, collaborating, to respond to such an event. We then actually had gone out to our strategic and critical suppliers with a revised key supplier questionnaire, because actually I think, the business continuity plans we did have, and we had lots of them, but none of them were, around about how a pandemic would be dealt with, which I think, none of us were prepared for that. We then developed a scoring methodology for assessing responses coming back, and, looking at a number of factors. So we had, the council spend against revenue, number of employees, whether the suppliers were local. We then had our data analysts within our data team develop a Power BI dashboard. So we were able to see at a glance where we had suppliers who were at risk. And this in turn allowed us to make various recommendations to our incident management teams, senior management teams, and really look at action where we needed to support our supply chains. So the Power BI dashboards was something that was fairly new, and we'd only really just started to investigate just before COVID how we might start to use Power BI to map in all the various data sources that we use as a procurement team. So we were looking at things like, building in filters by location. What was the supplier dependency on the council? So that was that spend against percentage of their revenue. How could we filter by supplier size, number of employees? We had filters by supplier categories, filter by suppliers at risk. We were then also able to map that out. So, having the map that I've shown on the slide, also looking at the numbers of suppliers per service area, and then how many of those per service area were at risk. So really building up a picture of data in a way that was fairly new, we hadn't done previously. So that was an opportunity, I guess. We might have taken slightly longer to develop something like that had COVID not hit. So I guess what the dashboard did show us was there was 4 real key critical commodity areas where we really needed to focus our efforts around about PPE, construction, transport and social care. We had crisis management work streams, and that was where that real collaborative working came in. So we had, finance, we had legal, we had ourselves, we had service areas, and we were all really working together to understand the supplier risks and where they would need support. And not only that, particularly in the case of PPE, really working cross-service to understand what our demand was, and how we could go about satisfying that demand. Those groups were also responsible for looking at scenario planning. So the information that we were feeding in through various dashboards, was really vital in that piece of work. And I think just in terms of that, the examples of the kind of cross-lateral working and the impact analysis, we had construction. So within City and Shire, speaking to the two construction teams there, it was felt, they had used quite a lot of the same suppliers. So we would hold joint meetings to try and agree a consistent approach across that sector locally. We also had our social care team, and similarly, they were also working within City and Shire, and developing processes with the relevant IJBs and social care teams within the councils. Sorry, I just realised I'd forgotten to ask for the slides to be skipped on. Too busy talking. You skip on again, please, and the next one. So I guess just to kind of skip on to where we faced kind of key challenges. Data was a significant challenge. I think, you hear the term quite a lot that we're data rich as organisations, and that's true, but I think often that data is spread across a lot of different systems, and it certainly is, in a procurement context. It did present us, I think, with an opportunity to try new ways of gathering information and reporting. We were using Microsoft Teams forms, and we were using Teams more, just in terms of communication. As I've already mentioned, we increased the use of Power BI. But the real lesson we took from that was, accuracy of data and ready access to data is absolutely critical going forward. Can you move on, please? Okay, and yeah, so I guess, we were doing all this work around about COVID and how we would respond. We were still in the background, looking at Brexit and how we were preparing around about that. And I think just in terms of the future challenges, so, we've got the effects of the virus, which are anticipated to continue into the foreseeable future. But as Hugh said at the start, I think, we are really starting to see the impacts of Brexit coming through, certainly in the first quarter of this year. And realistically, by the end of this quarter, that's likely to be, on the increase, and we're seeing more impacts coming through, particularly around about pricing, the cost of shipping having increased and the cost of containers, the increased import controls. I'm seeing delays and shortages in some cases. So the lessons from COVID learned, are similar to those that we can learn from the impact of Brexit. Next slide, please. Okay, so I guess our main lessons learned were that systems and data review, and we really need to have a review of our systems, look at where we're holding data, how, and how we can improve on that for future. Something we've always known, supply chain risk management is key. However, I think, in terms of our services, it wasn't always a priority. But COVID, Brexit has certainly brought that to the fore in their minds also. So we've got an opportunity to work with them there. Look at how we can report as a procurement team, as an organisation. Certainly Power BI is a great tool. Sorry, I sound a bit like I'm, sales rep for that, but actually it's been really useful for us in the context of, COVID, Brexit. Supplier relationship management, that's a crucial element, and also building resilient supply chains for the future. And I think all of these lessons are applicable to help mitigate supply chain impacts due to Brexit, to COVID, to commodity super cycle. And, you know, that work would really need to be supported by an agile procurement team. You know, we're performing more intensive tasks. But I guess as well, that team has to be supported with the right tools, you know, the right support, and the right learning and development needs to be available. Thank you. So if we skip on to the last slide, I've left one there for questions, but I think as Hugh said at the start, we'll take those either in the chat or at the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Mel. Great update and lots to think about, and some of which I'm sure we'll pick up in questions. So if we could please, Ola, share Mark's slides now. Hi, Mark, and over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh. You know, it's been fascinating from my perspective listening to the previous two presentations, and so much rings true for how things panned out in Dumfries and Galloway. I will apologise at the start for I am not a supply chain specialist. I'm not. It's not my area of expertise, so I'm coming at things from a slightly different perspective, and it will be interesting to tease out in the subsequent discussion some of the kind of higher level or broader subjects that I'll touch upon and how that can align with the thinking that's been set out in the previous presentations and what you guys do as part of your day job, because it's critical that these things will intersect going further down the line. So we can move to the next slide. I wanted to highlight from my as a resilience professional, the prospect of a global pandemic has been something that we have been aware of for a number of years, and it has been at the top of the UK and Scottish risk registers for quite some period of time. So in a way, it should not have came as a surprise that we were faced with this last year. However, what's interesting in terms of looking back and reflecting on it, the thinking and the planning was very much focused on a pandemic influenza outbreak, not COVID, not a novel virus, and certain areas of planning were well developed, but as highlighted in the first presentation, there were areas that are less so. So in terms of our national thinking, our regional and local thinking on contingency planning for a pandemic, the focus was very much on the healthcare impacts and on the potential bereavement impacts that would come with a global pandemic, but not anywhere near as much consideration or thinking with regards to wider societal impacts. That was quite clear in everybody's response to COVID last year as well, where there was a lot of dynamic planning, a lot of dynamic activity to actually address some of the things that we had to deal with as a kind of wider group of responders. Can we move to the next slide? So these are questions. I don't have answers. But I think they're actually important questions in terms of what we need to think about for the future. Were we prepared for an event in such a scale that the whole organisation and indeed the country required to pivot to face it? From my perspective, this is completely new. I've been involved in responding to various situations for quite a few years now, and this is the first time that we've seen a response on this scale in the UK for generations. Probably this was significant, and it was a game changer for that. Were we ready for lockdown, shielding, and those community focused aspects which required our attention? I think if we're all honest, I don't think we were. It's not something that we necessarily considered. Some initiatives were really new. Shielding, the concept of shielding and how we would do that, and then how we would deliver and support on those aspects, as has been highlighted in previous presentations, really leaned heavily on our supply chains and our core staff within the organisation who support schools, facilities and communities. And we hadn't really given that a great deal of consideration in advance. Lockdown itself, again, was a relatively novel concept, and those wider community considerations, absolutely not aspects that we could that we had the opportunity to necessarily plan for in advance. Did we appreciate how the pandemic would affect our services and our service users, and were our business continuity plans fit for purpose? For me, I would say no. Again, because the whole organisation had to pivot to respond to the pandemic, our current business continuity planning very much focused on specific interruptions to buildings, staffing, or indeed supply chains, but looking at it all in the whole, everything happening at once. The current planning systems that we had in place aren't really fit for purpose for doing that. And indeed, what was interesting, services that we considered as critical services in advance of the pandemic were services that were stood down, and those staff redirected towards other activities as well. So our appreciation and assessment of what is a critical activity for our own respective organisations had to change rather quickly as well. So I'm sure we all remember the rush for PPE and sanitizer back in early to mid 2020. And it really punches out, as well as the food considerations. From my perspective as a resilience person, what can we do to further embed supply chain considerations in our planning? It's all too easy to make assumptions that we know what we will need, but we don't necessarily think about the challenges that might be faced when we are looking at a large-scale, widespread, disruptive event, and the fact that multiple people could be looking for those same commodities and the challenges that we'll face. And of course, another one that we'll all be very familiar with, were we able to cope with the demands of our ever-evolving government policy development? That was an interesting one. It happened by necessity, so it's not a criticism, but it is something we had to be very flexible and adaptable to the policy decisions which were taken to meet the challenges that COVID provided. Next slide, please. So, and this is maybe more from our perspective in terms of what have we learned. I think we've all learned to be more adaptable, or we've demonstrated that we are more adaptable than we previously thought. There's no doubt, it's been referenced in the previous presentation, there are going to be lasting harms and a long road to recovery from COVID. There's no doubt about that, and in certain aspects of that, it will be years before we're fully recovered from the impacts of COVID. More than ever, we recognise the benefit of partnership working in all areas. This has been critical for us. We are blessed in Dumfries and Galloway in a way that we have coterminous boundaries with the NHS board, Health and Social Care Partnership, local police division, and the local fire service division as well. So partnership working comes naturally to us just because of that coterminosity. It stood us in good stead, but COVID has been a revelation in terms of broader partnership working and far more involvement with other agencies and indeed the third sector and the wider community. They have been an integral part of the response. And we certainly hope they will continue to be. And the presentation from Argyll and Bute certainly resonated with me in terms of working with third sector organisations and communities and actually responding and supporting people within the community. COVID-19 has undoubtedly broke down many barriers internally and externally, and it's my firm desire to make sure that we sustain that sense of shared endeavour going forward. Organisationally, particularly in large organisations like local authorities, it's very easy for silos to develop and for people to work without consideration of implications for our colleagues elsewhere. That disappeared during COVID. and it's really important to try and maintain that going forward. I know that might not be easy, and similarly, our relationship with our partners as well. We need to maintain that openness and shared working approach going forward. One of the big takeaways that we have seen is the accelerated change in terms of the use of technology, reduced travel, flexible working, and use of our buildings, most of which has been very, very welcome, and something that I'm sure the local authorities and public sector agencies across the country will absolutely welcome. But it does also pose some challenges that need consideration in terms of the social benefits of work, in terms of that face-to-face interaction, the disconnect between frontline workers at times and those who might be working at a more senior level who are working remotely as well. So whilst these accelerated changes are welcome, we do need to actually work through how that can practically be delivered in a successful way for everybody. And we will never have a better opportunity to reconsider our approaches to how we deliver services and serve those communities in our respective areas. I don't think we will see, hopefully, we will see another event of this scale. But the changes that have happened and the opportunity and the challenges that we will face further down the line as a result of COVID and EU exit mean that we're in that perfect window to affect quite significant change if the desire and the will is there. Next slide, please. I just wanted to touch a wee bit on EU exit from a Dumfries and Galloway perspective. Interestingly, for those of you who have been working on EU exit, I'm sure you'll agree that very much the planning that we've been undertaking for the past 2 or 3 years was focused on no deal and the potential significant impacts of no deal. Interestingly, for some of those impacts, late agreement of the deal mitigated those most significant impacts. But it is interesting to hear colleagues previously recognising that there's a feeling that EU exit related impacts are starting to be felt this year. It's not something as a council that we have seen direct significant impacts on, but we are certainly aware of challenges in the supply chain and logistics, both in terms of challenges on the English Channel crossings, but given we have the ferry crossings to Larne and Belfast here, we very much see that in terms of the Irish Sea crossings as well. Our feeling is that COVID has perhaps masked some EU exit impacts in terms of business and economy, or indeed they have been intertwined, and it'll probably be impossible to actually separate those out to identify what are EU exit impacts or COVID impacts. I think the challenges in supply chain, some of it, whether it be a lack of supply or cost increases, undoubtedly will be COVID focused, as well as EU exit focused. But there are other aspects in terms of the border controls which you can firmly plant at the feet of EU exit and the regulatory changes that resulted from that. For us locally, our biggest challenge going forward is the creation of a border control post or inland border facility, which will be related to the ports at Cairnryan. It's difficult to tell exactly what challenges that will bring. Hopefully, if it's planned correctly, it should be relatively seamless, but we are mindful of ongoing challenges in Northern Ireland in particular, in terms of the differences or the challenges that the Northern Ireland Protocol bring for businesses and the movement of goods back and forth across the North Channel. And we're certainly conscious of discussions ongoing between EU, UK government, between Scottish government and UK government, and the Welsh devolved administration with regards to future arrangements for the movement of goods between the island of Ireland and mainland UK as well. So we've got no doubt it's not a fixed position months with regards to that. Next slide. So just finally, to wrap up, from a council and a wider partnership perspective, these are 4 points I think that we're keeping at the front of our minds in terms of moving forward from both COVID and from any challenges related to EU exit. So we need to continue to meet immediate needs and simultaneously plan for a sustainable future. Like other areas in Scotland, we are still seeing outbreaks and clusters of COVID developing. The response aspect isn't going to go away anytime soon, but at the same time, we need to be planning for renewal and recovery of various parts of society as well. And that is going to be a challenge running with those multiple streams going forward. We need to respond quickly and well to support recovery, prioritising what we do and know if it's having our intended impact. And I think the previous presentation and highlighting the positive benefits of Power BI, absolutely from a Dumfries and Galloway perspective, we've used that to really good effect throughout COVID, and will continue to do that in terms of helping gather those metrics to ensure that whatever we're looking at is having its intended impact, or if not, what interventions are required. It's a really, really useful tool. We would highly recommend to others to use. And the last two are probably the most important points. Our partnerships are vital. We serve our communities together, and I've got no doubt in the future, as resources perhaps get tighter, funding gets tighter, we will actually have to work more closely together with our partner agencies and our communities and the voluntary sector to deliver the best for our public. And finally, we need to stay close to our communities, and they need to be at the heart of everything we do. I think that really COVID has really brought that to the fore, that we can't forget that we are public servants and we are here to serve the needs of the community, but we need to be mindful of that we don't do to the community. I think going forward we need to work with the community, and that's an approach we were certainly keen on taking forward. So that's me.
Once again, Mark, fantastic. Thank you very much. So we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left. So if Jane and Mel could unmute their cameras as well, we could perhaps open it up for some discussion. So once again, as I said at the start, everyone, please, if you have any questions, post them in the chat, and alternatively, if you raise your hand, we'll take the question verbally if that works. Couple of takeaways for me, you know, and for each of you, I've got a point. So Jane, you talked about or gave some great examples where sometimes the impact on, you know, of a service that you deliver is much greater than the financial cost. Mel talked about the importance of accurate and accessible data, which is a recurring theme in everything we do. And Mark, I think you made a great point, specifically about you don't know how effective your plans are until they're tested to their extreme. I think that probably fundamentally there was an important issue that ran through all of your pitches, and it was really about the importance of partnerships, the importance of relationships. So we work better if we do it collaboratively, and in order to work effectively collaboratively, we'll have to have good relationships. So again, goes back to the basics of developing and maintaining good relationships. So any questions from anyone in the audience? Stephen Brannigan's got his hand up, so Stephen.
Hugh, I'll always ask a question. You know that by now, right? Never invite me.
Thank you.
So I've got a question for all the panel. Can you tell me what's the #1 thing that you were able to implement as a result of COVID, and maybe even before we knew the term COVID, thought it was never possible? Is there any one thing that you've implemented that you would love to keep? I've shocked him, Hugh.
Yeah.
I guess for me, Stephen, it's not actually really related to, you know, the presentation that I gave today, but actually where we are now today. We're sitting on a virtual session through Microsoft Teams. We obviously, as a shared service, we've got people who are based in Inverness and Aberdeen. And I actually feel that one of the really unique things about the situation, the increased use of technology, has been that we've been able to work much more closely together with yourselves, you know, participation in UIGs, etc. I think Teams is a great thing, you know, to really bring people together. I don't think that we want to replace face-to-face entirely, but I do think it does allow for, you know, relationships, working with people. You know, people are much more accessible, able to attend things rather than having to travel. So I guess that's the one thing I'd like to quite keep up, is hosting virtual events and things like that. I think it's been fantastic in some ways.
Okay, thank you, Mel.
Mark, Jane, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll maybe come in here. I think from the thing that I'm most proud about our response in Dumfries and Galloway is the support and work with the communities that we've actually undertaken in partnership and with the third sector, specifically with regards to shielding and supporting vulnerable people and food distribution. That's been a game changer in terms of whether we've got a streamlined route in for people to actually access support, our framework through our facilities management team and their development of a solutions centre to actually deliver logistical solutions, which was absolutely amazing. And indeed then our work with community groups, community resilience teams, community food providers of all sorts, and actually provide an integrated service so that we're not stepping on anybody's toes, we're working together for common outcomes, and we're providing really, really good value for the people who need that support. I'm really proud of that aspect.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
Yeah, Mark has covered a whole load there that I could quite easily have said as well. Around school meals, there's been a huge amount of innovation and learning, be that in-class dining, use of pre-ordering apps and QR codes. There's been a huge amount of learning that I think we will capture, harness and use. And I know Scotland Excel are working on some of that tech aspect of it and in the development of a framework there about cashless catering and things like that in schools. From a cleaning perspective, which is obviously my other FM hat, it's not so much something that we don't want to, that we've implemented that we won't undo. It's more around how we're viewed as a service. So cleaning in the past was always seen as a Cinderella service. The magic fairies come in at night and the buildings get cleaned. And it was always one that was ripe for cutting and reducing. And we're at the stage now where cleaning services were at absolutely the lower end of acceptable. We're now in a situation where people have recognised the value and importance of making sure our schools and buildings are well maintained and well cleaned. And having people like Professor Jason Leach say that our cleaning staff are actually saving lives helps to raise the profile. So Mark touched on it earlier about we need to review what we deem as critical services. And I think there's some learning in there that we need to make sure all of our councils across Scotland recognise.
I think that's a very good point and very well made, Jane, because I think what's been apparent, certainly in my experience, is members of communities have got much greater awareness of some of the challenges that frontline service delivery has caused, and I think that they would absolutely recognise that officers across the councils have really gone above and beyond, and lots of people have said that to me in the passing. So I think it's a very, very good point and very well made. So thank you, first of all, to all of our panellists. We're almost out of time, so thank you. Insightful, very interesting, and thank you for those that attended. Hopefully you found it equally interesting. The next session for within the stream of leadership in a post-COVID-19 world is A Changing Nation, how Scotland will thrive in a digital world. Again, I'll be hosting the session, and Martin Wallace from the local government digital office will be participating, and that's at 11:30. So hopefully I will see you there. But once again, thanks to all the panelists and thanks to everyone for attending. Thank you.